All right, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. We're really happy to have you for what is going to be a really thrilling conversation. So I'm Dr. Amanda Ryman. I am the Chief Knowledge Officer at New Frontier Data. And today we're going to be talking all about the cannabis consumer in part 3 of our consumer series, where we'll be diving into archetypes of specific types of cannabis consumers so we can learn more about how the market is becoming differentiated and why cannabis consumers are no longer considered a monolith. So I'm going to let our two amazing and esteemed guests introduce themselves, and then we're going to jump in. So Lily, take it away.
Hey, everybody. My name is Lily Kainanen. I'm the branding and packaging designer at Changemaker Creative, working with cannabis companies with heart.
Excellent. Diane?
Hi, I'm Diane Downey, and I'm a co-founder and CEO of Rebel Spirit. We have a farm in Oregon and our brand in Oregon, and we're taking our brand nationwide, leading with our pre-roll packs.
Excellent. Well, so glad to have you ladies join us today to talk a bit about how we take this information about archetypes and use it to create brands, use it to develop marketing, and to really think about who our target consumer is. So just a few housekeeping things. In just a minute, we're going to launch a very exciting poll that we would like for you to fill out. We will be giving the results about halfway through the webinar. And if you have questions for us, you can put questions in the Q&A. If this is something that we can answer while we're talking, we will absolutely do so. If not, then we can get back to you later with the answers to the questions. But this is really meant to be interactive amongst the audience as much as it is amongst the panelists. So with that, we're going to launch a poll. So you will see a poll appearing on your screen. Just a few questions about who you are, what role you play in the industry, and kind of why you're here today and which archetype you're most interested in learning about. So go ahead and answer that poll anytime during the webinar, and we will be showing you the results here in just a little bit. But I think we've got so much to go over that we should definitely jump in. All right, so let's look a bit at the cannabis consumer archetypes from a 10,000-foot view. Now, you are probably like, what are these names? What do these mean? And we'll definitely get into this. But I wanted to show folks the spread that we see within the cannabis consumer population of these different archetypes. Now, something you may notice off the bat is that no one archetype covers more than 20% of the entire consumer base. So this idea that all cannabis consumers are the same, or that maybe there's just 2 or 3 different varieties, is not something that we're seeing. So, Lily and Diane, before we jump in, let me just ask you, does this surprise you or not, given what you know about cannabis consumers? How about you, Lily?
Yeah, I was definitely surprised that it was this fragmented. I kind of did have that assumption that there's like a big chunk of it that is still like the one type, the type that we all know. But yeah, this is really fascinating.
And
how about you, Diane?
Well, that Oregon is a more mature state, and so those archetypes are in the back of our minds, subliminally at least, as cannabis business people in Oregon. Whether we realize it or not, we've been playing to them for years. And so this is a great venue that's making that subliminal knowledge explicit.
Oh, I love that. Yeah. I mean, we definitely have kind of talked about, I think even before legalization, we all kind of knew different types of consumers. And, now really looking at the science behind that and what that means across a few key demographics is really going to give us some insight. As you said, Diane, how do we take that that's in the back of our minds and then operationalize it and use it for business development? So first, we're going to start off by talking about some specific demographics that we have found are really indicative of certain archetypes. And I don't think any of this will surprise folks in terms of, oh yeah, we know that frequency and gender and some of these things really differentiate consumers. But to really look across the archetypes, and you see a huge differentiation between certain types of consumers and others across these key variables. So for example, looking at use frequency, we see that, most cannabis consumers are frequent consumers. So, looking at the average consumer versus some of these other archetypes, we definitely see that frequent consumption at least once a week, which is represented by the magenta and the pink bars, is pretty common across most archetypes. Something that's really interesting is that we have these 3 archetypes, which we'll get into later, who are not frequent consumers. And I think, we, at least in my head for a long time, have thought about cannabis consumers as either being frequent or infrequent. And then thinking about even within those infrequent consumers, we have different types of consumers, and which of those infrequent consumers has the most potential to become a frequent consumer, and which are more likely to just kind of stay in that infrequent type of use pattern. Do either of you have questions or thoughts about use frequency?
Yeah, because I feel like we used to differentiate between like users and non-users, and how can we like get people converted. But then there's a lot of people out there who are buying just really infrequently, or not buying at all. They're just getting it from their friends. So
and I think too, again, seeing the Oregon market mature, those who were non-users or infrequent users are becoming more frequent users as they become acquainted with the products available and the ways of using, and get comfortable with the idea of using. I'm seeing use frequency among individuals go up, maybe not to daily use, but more than just occasionally.
Yeah, really interesting.
Sure.
I want to clarify, there was a question that came in about whether this is THC or CBD products. This is just consumption. So this could be THC, it could be CBD. We're basically just asking folks, how often do you consume cannabis? So I just wanted to make that clear. All right, let's look a bit at the market context, because, when we talk about who's consuming and how much they're consuming, obviously whether they have access is going to play a role in that frequency sometimes, sometimes not. So I want to call attention to the fact that, there's one archetype in particular that's really defined by market, and that is the legacy lifestyler. So, we'll talk about that when we get more into the specific archetypes, but folks that are not living in legal markets, either they are a non-medical patient in a medical market or they're living in an illicit market. How do brands kind of think about people that are not yet in a regulated market and how they reach out to them and do brand awareness? Or do you just not? And do you just wait until they've entered a legal marketplace? Diane, I'd like to hear from you with your company. Are you already doing R&D into markets that are not yet online, or are you really focusing on folks that currently have access?
Well, a couple years ago, we were pretty sold on the idea of marketing hemp pre-rolls in pre-THC states. And the hemp market has been so bonkers that we decided not to pursue that. But that has been an idea of ours. But in addition, states are coming on so quickly now. We're finding that we're having trouble keeping up with our opportunities for moving into states where THC is available. But I do think that CBD and hemp, smokable hemp, are the gateway for brands that are THC brands to move into markets as they become legal for THC.
Very interesting. And I think when you look at this chart, we notice that not everyone who consumes infrequently is living in an illicit market. So there might be an assumption that someone is consuming infrequently because they don't have access.
Mm-hmm.
But when you look at the archetype of the engaged explorer, which we'll get into a little bit later, they're not necessarily frequent consumers because they're still trying to kind of figure out, to your point, Diane, where they fit in this legal marketplace, but they do live in legal markets. So even within accessible markets, you still have archetypes that are infrequent consumers or are on their way to being frequent consumers as they kind of figure out which products work best for them. And so another, dimension here is self-identified user type. So one of the things we found from our consumer survey this year, we did divvy up the consumer type into 4 categories. So instead of the dichotomous medical recreational that you see a lot of the time, we allowed consumers to also select mostly medical or mostly recreational as an identifier. And sure enough, over half of the folks who are consuming say they consume for both reasons. And so when you look among this group, that is squarely in the savvy connoisseurs. So we're going to talk about the savvy connoisseurs. I think, and Lily, I'd love to know what you think about this before we get too deep into it. But the savvy connoisseurs are kind of that group that everyone wants to market to, because they are the ones who love cannabis. They use all kinds of products. They evangelize the products that they love. So when thinking about like a branding or a packaging point of view, what are some of the differentiating factors between how people brand for an adult use consumer versus a medical consumer?
Yeah, and I think the savvy connoisseur is such a enticing market for all of us, because that's also most of us. So it's always so tempting to sell to basically yourself as a target market. Yeah, the medical and recreational market, it's so interesting because like historically the medical market products kind of did used to look more pharmaceutical like. And I feel like now with so many states being recreational, even the medical states like Florida, it doesn't really like look medical.
Well, to your point, we probably all saw the news yesterday
Right.
that they're going to start selling cannabis in Circle K in Florida. And, Circle K definitely isn't the type of place you think about as a pharmacy or, a place where people are necessarily getting medicine, although they do sell Tylenol and Advil and some of the over the counter. But, to that point, Diane, I would say, and please correct me if I'm wrong, your product, I think, speaks to an adult use consumer, given that, the type of the form factor. But do you think that there's also a place amongst the medical market for products that maybe appeal more, given that so many people are using for both reasons?
That's a really good question. And I think that what we need to do as marketers is meet consumers where they are. So I think that you've got medical consumers who consume recreationally, but they don't necessarily want to think of themselves as recreational users, and vice versa. And so you could have somebody who identifies as being a medical user who comes home and uses THC to wind down in the evening, maybe to handle their anxiety, and thereby lives a good lifestyle. You could have another person who's a recreational user who comes home, uses THC to unwind and have a good evening. They consider themselves recreational, and maybe they are recreational users. It could be too that using that THC in the evening is obviating a medical need that they might have if they weren't using THC. And so I think it's really important to let the consumers identify as they want and to make them feel comfortable identifying as they want. And so at least with Rebel Spirit, our mode is not to be exclusionary. We started as a medical brand in Oregon, knowing that we were going to rec. But I think that we don't want to scare away, at least in for Rebel Spirit, we don't want to scare away medical users by being too edgy in our marketing. But we do identify as a recreational brand.
Well, I think your point is really well taken about, people's own intentions around consuming and where that line is. I may consider myself a recreational consumer because I'm using to unwind at the end of the day. But if I wasn't using cannabis to unwind, would I be drinking alcohol? Would I be taking, an anti-anxiety pill? And so I think that there are questions about what would you be doing if you did not have access that may really be impacting disease states and other types of things. So to that point, looking at the primary reason for use and looking at, unwinding versus a true medical use, relaxation is like the number one reason why we hear people using cannabis, right? Like when we do our consumer survey and we're asking you, why are you using cannabis? To relax. That is a very broad term. to relax. So, when we look at this, again, we see a little bit of the follow-on of the medical versus recreational among the medical lifestylers, the modern medicinals, and our holistic healers, who are definitely looking at what they would consider more of a medical reason for use. However, savvy connoisseurs and other folks, infrequent partakers even, there's definitely a wellness component to their use. And there really aren't any groups where there's complete rejection of one type of use or the other. Lily, do you have any thoughts when it comes to packaging and intention? The last webinar that we did was all about consumer intentions. So what they're looking to get out of their experience. So when you're thinking about packaging, for example, is there a relationship between the type of packaging you might recommend or design and the intention that you think that consumer group has for their use?
Absolutely. So if you think about, it's basically the same use case, whether you're using it for like stress and anxiety versus like relaxing just for funsies. So the packaging and the branding and the messaging on the package kind of needs to talk to that, because if the consumer is looking for just something where they want to chill out and relax and have like an enjoyable time, that's a totally different look than like, I have crippling anxiety, help me cope with all of this.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And, given that there's so much overlap there, it's,
Right.
and because so much has to be on the packaging anyway, at least here in California with all the warnings and everything, I think it can be tough for brands to really think about how they use packaging to reach those target consumers and not alienate other consumers. Because as you mentioned, if I consider myself a medical cannabis patient and I consider my use to be medical, if I'm a modern medicinal or a medical lifestyler, I may be turned off by packaging that alludes to the fact that my use may be recreational.
Mm-hmm.
So it's interesting. I think part of what we want to do with this information is get people comfortable with this idea of dual use and get people comfortable with, you can be a medical consumer and you can be adult use consumer. And it all depends on the intention. And you don't necessarily have to hold on to one identity versus another, which can be tough, especially in a state that's a medical cannabis state where that identity is equal to legality. So it's really interesting to see as more states move into adult use, who are medical. I'm thinking about states like Florida. What will that do to people's own self-identity, especially if they're now getting their cannabis at the gas station?
Right. And that's the whole thing. Like the packaging really primes the experience. So if they're looking for a result for a problem that they have in their life, and you tell them this is for that, that's also how they're going to feel consuming it most of the time. If you kind of prime it like this is going to make you relax, then it's going to relax them.
Well, yeah, we could do, oh my gosh, we could do a whole webinar on the placebo effect and whether it's a good thing or a bad thing. But I mean, to your point, I was at a dispensary yesterday and now they have a whole line of products for sleep that are CBN heavy and dominant. And so, it's kind of like, is it suggestive? If I take this expecting it to help me sleep or that's what it's for, does that impact sleep? So, a lot that we could get into about people's expectations, which is kind of drawn out in this chart, and how that relates to what they think the product will do for them and whether they think that they were successful.
Right.
So, another area that we look at quite often are cannabis forms used. So looking at who's using flower, who's using non-flower. And so as you can see, again, we see that there's definitely some archetypes that are more in the non-flower or both flower and non-flower. And then some that are still really primarily flower. And even among infrequent, right? So talking about how just because someone is using frequently or infrequently, it doesn't necessarily impact whether they're using for medical reasons, whether they live in an illicit market state. And so similarly here, social nibblers and infrequent partakers are both infrequent consumers. And we'll talk more about that. But social nibblers are primarily infrequent edibles users, where infrequent partakers are primarily infrequent smokers. So even within that forms used, you've got variations of frequency and, thinking again about who your target consumer is and what they're using it for. Someone who's a social nibbler is someone that's, oh, I'm going to go to a party this month. Maybe I want to have a light edible before I go. Whereas a savvy connoisseur also using non-flower forms, but is weaving that consumption more into their everyday practice. Any thoughts about form factors, Lily, when it comes to packaging and trying to look at like who are the flower consumers versus the manufactured product consumers?
Yeah, this is why data like this is so important, that you don't just go off of vibes, so that you're making sure that like the product that you're creating and the market that you want to target, that it's something that they do want. If you're trying to market to somebody who really just only wants to smoke a pre-roll every now and then, it doesn't make sense to try to market like a tincture to them, because they're not going to want it. And
Right,
vice
right.
versa.
Diane, do you have thoughts on that?
Well, I do. I think that the statistic here that's super interesting is the infrequent partakers being so heavily into the smokables. And I think that I know you'll get more into each archetype later, but the infrequent partakers are often not purchasing product themselves.
Right.
They're going along in probably a party situation, taking something that's offered them. And generally speaking, an edible is more, to take an edible is a bigger commitment. It's a bigger time commitment, and it's a little more strategic as far as, well, when is this going to activate? Whereas sharing a joint or something is more spur of the moment. And I think that that's a really interesting marketing tool too, is that the infrequent partakers are probably a little more spontaneous in their use.
Yep. Yeah. And we're going to definitely get to that. And you're absolutely right. Infrequent partakers are those folks at the party that if the joint gets passed around, they will consume. They're unlikely to buy their own. These aren't folks that are necessarily hitting up the dispensary. And so again, are they people that we even market to? If they're not buying product, if they're not doing that, then, really understanding that, and who amongst that group may be more likely to become a more frequent consumer.
Exactly.
And what's the relationship between the market they live in and all of that with that adoption. I think that makes a ton of sense. We did have a question come in about methodology for the archetypes. So I just want to address that really quickly. I apologize for not doing that at the beginning. So these are determined via a process called cluster analysis, where basically you're taking all of the variables that we collect on these individuals, and we're looking to see if there's natural groups that they fall into. So we're going over these kind of key defining variables today that really, I think, cut the different archetypes, but it's a lot more than just that goes into determining them. So, to Diane's point, what we were just discussing, it is things like acquisition. Where are they getting it from? Are they getting it from a formal source? Are they getting it from an informal source? How frequently are they purchasing? How much are they spending when they do purchase? So all of that data is in depth in our report. So a little plug for the report, which you can download off our website, that goes into details on the methodology and also has way more than we're presenting today on the different variables related to these different archetypes. All right, so let's take a look at most frequently used form. So again, a lot of this is going to be differentiated between flower and smokable products and manufactured products. And even though there may be an assumption that people that consider themselves medical consumers are more into the manufactured products like edibles and tinctures, that's not true with the medical lifestylers. And, we saw a few slides ago that these are folks that are firmly in the camp of medical consumption. Yet they're consuming through smoking and through other combustible flower forms. And I think that's really interesting, because one of the criticisms that we hear from prohibitionists is that nobody smokes medicine. So like medical cannabis in its current form can't really be a thing because nobody smokes medicine. Of course, we look at the historical use of cannabis. We find that it has indeed been smoked as a medicine for thousands of years. But, do you see any kind of pushback in the work that you do? And Diane, I'll start with you because, your pre-rolls, your form factor is very much on the smoking side. It's not something that people are vaporizing. It's coming in the form ready to light. So, do you feel, again, going back to that medical recreational identity, Have you seen, kind of the medical consumer adopt that as medicine? We know that titration is important. We know onset is important. So can you talk a little bit more about how your product functions as a medical product when it is smoked?
Yeah, I think that that's interesting. And if you look at the examples of Oregon and California, where there were really good established medical markets before the rec market came along, that's where you saw a lot of overlap between recreational smokers and medical smokers that all had their medical cards. So you could be a medical smoker and you could go to a doctor and get your card, or you could be a recreational smoker that says, oh, I get these headaches, and so then you get, because these are people who want to buy their product legally and have it available to them in a dispensary. And I think that it is in smoking that there gets to be some overlap. When we first went into this business 7 years ago, there were some people who raised their eyebrows and clutched their pearls a little bit, because I am a pretty conservative person. And they said, well, of course, you're just doing that medical marijuana. You're not doing that other stuff. And I said, well, no, it's marijuana, and people can use it however they want. And I'm not here to judge them. And so again, I think it's about meeting the consumers where they are, knowing that there is a lot of overlap, and embracing that overlap and letting people choose the brand and choose the product that they want.
Well, I think that makes a ton of sense. And, this isn't the topic for the webinar today, but I'm going to say it anyway. It brings up, kind of the issue with the arbitrary lists of conditions in medical states for which people can obtain cannabis, because, they're kind of deciding at the state level via the law, these are the people that are legally, medical consumers, and these are people that aren't. And a lot of times that list of conditions is not based on science. It's not based on need. It's based on assumptions and kind of what's acceptable. And so, looking at this, for example, as we mentioned, the legacy lifestylers, those are folks that are in illicit markets. So yes, 100% of them are using like smoked flower, but is that because they are in markets where they aren't able to access well-tested, standardized manufactured products? And so, it's kind of like what they have access to, regardless of what they would like to have access to, might be influencing which forms they're using. All right, let's look a little bit about age and gender, and then we're going to get into the actual archetypes. So if you haven't filled out the poll yet, fill out the poll, because we're going to look at the results here in just a few minutes. But looking at age distribution, we definitely see savvy connoisseurs trending towards being younger. And then we see, kind of the more medicinal products or groups like the medical lifestylers, the modern medicinals, the holistic healers, trending older. That is not surprising. We see that in the consumer data in general. I mean, let's face it, luckily for them, younger folks just don't have as many medical needs for the most part as older folks. But we do see this kind of transition in identity, where people are using for fun and everything when they're younger, and then, they hit their 30s and now, there's some aches and pains, and there's some issues with sleep, and, they're kind of rediscovering cannabis as they age. So, Lily, I want to ask you this. When you're thinking about packaging, how does age come into play when you're thinking about what information is important, what type of positioning in the market is important for people that are maybe on the older side versus the younger side?
Yeah, for sure. Like the older, like if you're targeting like the older holistic healers type of person, just simply making sure that the medical use person will be able to open the package is a major thing. A lot of those child resistant packages are really tough to open, even for me, and healthy but tiny hands. And also like things just like images that you're using on your social needs to kind of look like the age group that you're targeting. Not everybody should be targeting 25-year-olds. There should be a bit more variety in that, in my opinion, and just also type size. There's so much stuff that we need to put on the package that it's a little trickier once you get older to read the 6-point type. So that's also, if you're targeting older folks, that's something you need to consider in contrast.
I think,
well, that's really interesting. Go ahead, Diane.
Well, I just think this slide is amazing to look at, because the savvy connoisseurs are the only demographic or the only archetype that has a majority of users are 34 and under. So we're not, as an industry, really, we should be marketing to 34 and older, because your research shows that a gross majority of consumers are over 34.
Yeah, and I was surprised how evenly it's split. I was kind of expecting more strict variety on the age groups.
Well, I think some of that may have to do with form factor. And how that plays into it. When you look at the ones that are skewing older, like the holistic healers, for example, the modern medicinals, those are folks that are using manufactured products. They're using tinctures, they're using topicals. They aren't using as much the smoked flower. And then, looking at folks like engaged explorers, who are not frequent consumers, but they're interested. So I think there's this kind of assumption that the people that are trying to figure it out and are going out and trying a bunch of products are younger. But I think, it's also folks that are re-entering the market. And that's something else we could really talk about is, you've got folks that are young, and they're in this market because they're now 21 or they're young and this is kind of their social practice. You have people that never left. Right. And they're kind of the lifestylers that we'll talk about. And then you have folks that were there maybe 30 years ago, 40 years ago, and left and are now coming back and trying to figure out which products are going to be most appropriate for them and want to understand the different form factors that weren't available to them the last time they were engaged in cannabis. So it doesn't surprise me that much to see amongst like the engaged explorers and the social nibblers and even the infrequent partakers, that age skew may not be because they can't handle their weed, which is what I think a lot of people assume it is, and more because they're getting their feet wet and they're getting their back into the cannabis scene and are trying to take it slow and be more intentional about their consumption.
Can I do a little side tangent here?
Yeah, please.
So I'm wondering if the tendency to target younger audiences has to do with budtenders being so young and us kind of as brands trying to win over the budtender who thinks old people products are like dorky and stupid. And because like from this, it looks like we really should be skewing older, like you said. And not to mention like disposable income levels are very different for somebody who's like 21 versus somebody who's 55.
Right. And, the millennials. So I did a report not too long ago on millennial consumers. And, the millennials are kind of this first cohort that has destigmatized cannabis by kind of growing up when the laws were changing, that has some disposable income because now they're in their 30s and 40s. But also has young kids at home. And, what that does to the products that people choose, right? So maybe not choosing so much smoking, but looking at products that can be consumed stealthily or while the kids are there and they don't know. And, who are those consumers and what are we marketing to them? Are we just trying to sell them flour? Are we trying to think about sophisticated products that aren't, 1,000 milligram shots? And so I think, the sleep products that I saw and some of the products that I'm starting to see come out around menopause and women who are aging, I mean, yay. But I think that's understanding that there is definitely a place in that group of people that you said have disposable income. They have real issues that they're dealing with. They're not just trying to find things for fun, but they're trying to specifically target a symptom. And then they're looking for what is the novel product on the market that's going to help meet that goal. And I don't think, to your point, that companies are doing enough to think about that consumer, at least not what I see when I go into most dispensaries. So let's look a little bit about gender, because this is also really interesting. So, we see gender being pretty even in most groups, except for, again, these very highly medicalized or very infrequent partaking groups. So, the infrequent partakers, we see the balance of gender, I think partially because they're mostly smokers. When we look at the social nibblers, though, the holistic healers, the modern medicinals, these are female heavy groups. So Diane, I'm curious with your product, what you've seen in terms of gender adoption, if there's been differences between men and women.
I haven't, and I think that it wasn't necessarily intentional on our part as we went to market. We went to market not wanting to market to women specifically or to market to men specifically. And so, and I don't have statistics regarding the Rebel Spirit user, whether it's mostly men or mostly women. As far as I know, it's pretty balanced for our brand, at least. Because we chose to go gender neutral in our marketing.
And that, the gender neutral question is an interesting one, Lily. And I want to know what you think about this, because just from and this is just anecdotal, N equals 1. When I go to a dispensary, I feel like it's either or. I feel like the products are either super masculine focused in their colors and their wording and the brand and the logo, or it's trying to be like, hey, we're for women. Like we're pink and we have flowers and so are you seeing more of a move towards gender neutrality where it's not trying to pull in one gender, but it's not trying to turn one off either?
Yeah, I definitely see that. And I feel like it must be a thing where women might be more willing to buy the manly looking thing, but not the other way around. And yeah, I think I've seen less stuff that is like pink anymore, where it's like, this is lady weed. So a lot of the really successful branding projects that I've seen recently are more kind of neutral, just goes either way. Because like, I think the assumption was for the longest that most cannabis consumers are male, but like these numbers show different. It's pretty even.
Yeah. I mean, and we're definitely, seeing more women get involved in cannabis consumption. We see that, amongst the younger groups. But I think to your point, which I just think is really interesting, so I'm going to say it again, is that, we do find that women are going to be more likely to pick a product that is neutral or trends male versus men picking a product that trends female. And we see that's outside of cannabis. This is not just a cannabis phenomenon, but, women wear pants and no one says anything. A man wears a skirt and it's a big hullabaloo. So I think that there is something to be said for it being easier for women to identify with something that's geared masculine than men being able to identify with something that's geared feminine, just because of society. And how we describe gender roles. So it's really interesting to see that also happening in cannabis.
I just like to say with brands, when it comes to gender as well, that, I think that marketers should be looking at the form factor of the product. So because because women seem to tend towards edibles, it makes sense to have, if you're going to have a gender specific brand, that would be an edible. If you look at tobacco, I'm trying to think of women's brands for cigarettes. And that was, all I'm thinking of is Virginia Slims.
Right.
And I don't even know if Virginia Slims still exist, but, yeah, so when it comes to smokables, I think it doesn't make a lot of sense to try to market just to men or just to women.
Yeah. Virginia Slims. I remember, wasn't that like You've Come a Long Way, baby?
Yeah.
Yeah, and like women are also the household purchasing agents. So women might be going into the store to buy for their mom or their like neighbor and their spouses, men in their lives. Like it's also worth remembering.
That's how it works in my household. So I want to bring up a question that came to us from Canada, because I think this is interesting and I think I have a quick answer for it, which is that at one point, 80% of new users in Canada after legalization were female. And why might we have seen that? And so I'm just going to give a quick answer to that, which is that historically, it's definitely been a higher risk for women to use cannabis when it's illegal. They're usually the primary caregivers in the household to, whether that's the person that goes out and buys everything or takes care of the kids. This was a role that it was very hard for women to give up or to risk having children taken away, just being a mother and the stigma that women face around being a parent and being a cannabis consumer is not the same as men. So I think that keeps women not only from maybe consuming cannabis, but probably more likely admitting it. So, I doubt that those women were necessarily not consuming before, but they may just not have admitted it because of the stigma and because of the legal risk. So traditionally, women are underrepresented in any kind of drug self-reporting for that reason. So I just wanted to bring that up. All right. So before we get into the actual archetypes, and I'm super excited about this, I would love to have the poll up here again. So Noah, I don't know if this is something, there it is. So let's look at the results. So it looks like 63% of you are in markets where THC is currently allowed. It looks like most of you are in retail. About half of the folks in the audience right now are retailers, followed by processors and cultivators. In terms of primary role, it looks like we've got a lot of founders in the audience. Well, welcome. Thank you for taking time out of your day, because I know that you do not have a lot of time. So we really appreciate you coming and listening. And then marketing and branding. So perfect. That's the exact audience that we want for this kind of discussion. And then which archetype you're most interested in? Well, just like our archetypes, we have quite the difference among folks. So it looks like contemporary lifestylers are definitely very popular. I think a lot of people will probably see themselves in the contemporary lifestyler group, followed by the savvy connoisseurs, engaged explorers. So yeah, you all are interested in seeing all of them. Great, because that's what we're going to move into next. So I'm just trying to see, there we go. I'm going to, share results. There we go. I'm sharing the results. So everyone should be able to see it. All right. Yeah. Sorry about that. We're still kind of getting all the technical stuff figured out here. Okay. So we are going to start by looking at, okay, it keeps coming up. We are going to start by looking at these different profiles. Hopefully the poll will not pop back up again. So we're going to start with the savvy connoisseur. And what we're going to do here, folks, is we're going to go through these profiles. We're going to talk about the little narrative that kind of describes who this person is. And then we're going to talk about some key demographics for each of these profiles, and welcome Lily and Diane to give their thoughts about implications for marketing to this specific type of consumer and what folks might want to think about when it comes to branding and marketing. So again, please feel free to post any questions that you have as we go through this, and we will try to answer them live. So let's start with the savvy connoisseur, because let me tell you, when it comes to who's consuming the cannabis, like who's consuming it and all the different cannabis and all the different types, this is the type of person we're looking at, which probably shouldn't surprise folks. So let's take a quick look at the savvy connoisseur. So Charlotte moved from Montana to Southern California 10 years ago after graduating with a computer science degree. She's been smoking cannabis prolifically since college. Now in her 30s, Charlotte still enjoys flower, along with most cannabis products, but has primarily transitioned to vapes as a means to discreetly manage her stress throughout the day. At home, she keeps a bar cart stocked with infused beverages, a few different kinds of edibles, depending on her mood. Charlotte enjoys trips to the dispensary and often shares newfound products with her friends. So she is consuming multiple times a day. And she's living, almost all savvy connoisseurs, about 70% of them are legal consumers. So they're living in a legal market. About 82% identify as both medical and recreational. So we talked about those folks that are like, well, it depends. Sometimes I'm using for medical purposes. Sometimes I'm using for recreational purposes. And they're using everything. So instead of some of these other folks who are also using almost every day or every day, they're also using multiple times a day. But they're not using both types. They're just using flower. And we'll get to those folks. These folks are using both flower and non-flower. And as we mentioned before, their primary reason for use, a little under half of them, are using for the purposes of unwinding. So before we move on to the next archetype, let's talk a little bit about the savvy connoisseur. So, I think that when I think of the savvy connoisseur, I actually think of my brother. I'm not sure if he's watching, but, he's got the little bar cart with all of his edibles and his products, and he likes to try new things when it comes out in the dispensary. He lives in a legal market. And he's a bit of an evangelist. So if he has a product he tries that he really likes, he's telling his friends, he's telling his family. So I feel that the savvy connoisseur is kind of like your perfect evangelist, because not only are they trying a bunch of different products, but if they like something, they're going to go tell all their friends, they're going to bring it to the next party. So Lily, I'm going to start with you. When we talk about the savvy connoisseur, what type of branding or packaging do you feel really speaks to them?
Yeah, that's interesting because they are so widely like going for all the things. So I feel like the savvy connoisseur probably won't be turned off by um, recreational looking packaging. So I think they could go for kind of the wild and fun, or even like the seasonal special stuff. Like if you do like a limited run holiday thing, that could be a thing that they definitely would buy and try. um yeah, I'm trying to think, like if they're probably gonna go for like kind of splashy, interesting looking things, because if they're going into the store asking like, hey, what's new, what's exciting, they're probably gonna grab the things that like are eye-catching, and for them it probably can look weedy, and it will be fine with them because they're into it. It's their whole lifestyle.
Yeah, it's definitely part of their identity. So I think you're correct that, they aren't necessarily looking for discretion. These are folks that are more loud and proud about being cannabis consumers and actually like to demonstrate their knowledge by bringing new products and kind of being that person amongst their friends that like has the lowdown on like the new thing, or, kind of what the trends are. So, Diane, thinking about your product, which I would say is kind of like a tried and true product, right? It's like, kind of what we think of when we think of like cannabis. How would you market to the savvy connoisseur that would differentiate your product from some of the others on the market?
Well, I was just in looking at these statistics. It was making me think that this is evidence that shows that Rebel Spirit needs to not just market pre-rolls, right? So if we want to get our products out there, we need to have, which we do, a pre-roll and an edible and a concentrate. We've got a topical. So to try to hit those evangelists in all kinds of places, because this savvy connoisseur is going to be the one who helps us cross over and get to other archetypes, say with our edible or our beverage or whatever. So that's what I see when I see this consumer. Is this is good evidence for having a good product line that is not just smoke.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm. And
I love
newness.
that. And I do think that, these folks have a bit of brand loyalty, because, they're purchasing quite often. And I will mention that, we look at where these folks are acquiring their cannabis. Most of them are acquiring it at a licensed entity, because they do use both flower and non-flower products. So, to your point, Diane, they could buy one type of Rebel Spirit product and love it and then be an evangelist for the brand. And so, these are the folks who are like, again, wanting to demonstrate their cannabis knowledge. So they like to know which is good, which is bad, which is new, and to lead people through those verticals of certain brands that they appreciate. I think that the savvy connoisseurs are probably going to be the best brand ambassadors you could hope for, who are not being paid by you. Any other thoughts on savvy connoisseurs before we move on to the next group?
All right. This person is definitely the friend who you go and ask what should I get, and they will recommend stuff.
Yeah, or come to the store with me,
right?
Or look at the menu with me. I am an instructor for the Ganjier program, which is kind of creating the sommelier for cannabis. And so for the past 2 years, have been examining hundreds of students that are coming through the program. And they're the savvy connoisseurs. I mean, as a group, right? So they are the folks that love cannabis so much that they want to become sommeliers. They want to be able to have the knowledge to talk about all the different aspects of cannabis, and they are frequent consumers. So, these are people that where cannabis again is part of their lifestyle, but they're not necessarily lifestylers. So let's get into what a lifestyler is and how they might be different than a savvy connoisseur. All right. So let's look at the contemporary lifestylers. So a lot of you are interested in this archetype. It's very possible that a lot of you in the audience are this archetype. So contemporary lifestylers, Jeff is 40 and lives in Washington State his entire life. He primarily smokes cannabis labeled sativa, but also enjoys live resin edibles, which he swears provide a completely different experience than either distillate or isolate-based edibles. Jeff used to start the day with a bowl, but has in the past few years switched to a tabletop vaporizer. He still smokes in the evening to unwind and help him sleep. Jeff uses a delivery service to resupply every other week. He usually buys the same brands unless something he is curious about is on sale. So like the savvy connoisseurs, these are people that are consuming multiple times a day. They are 100% legal consumers. So this is one of the things that really differentiates contemporary lifestylers. As you noticed from the narrative, this isn't somebody that's like, well, let's see what's available or see what I can get. They're going to the grocery store when they go to a dispensary, when they order delivery. They want the things that they like. They want the things that they know. They want the things that are fitting into their lifestyle. Most of these folks are identifying as recreational. So these are not people that are necessarily looking to address back pain or insomnia throughout the day, but are really looking to incorporate cannabis into their life in a regular way, but they're not connoisseur about it, if that makes sense, right? So, they always bring their own weed to the party. They always use their own stuff that they really like, but they're not out there telling everyone to try what they just brought, because chances are that's just for them, because that's their own supply that they use in order to continue their lifestyle. Over half are using both flower and non-flower, but 44% use flower only. So again, these are all people living in legal markets. Some of them, flower is just part of their lifestyle. It's just really what they consume. It's who they are. They really aren't thinking of changing. And again, unwinding. So, these folks are primarily what we consider recreational consumers. So you see very few, only 6% say that they're using cannabis for medical purposes. So how about these contemporary lifestylers? Lily, I'll start with you. How might the packaging and labeling differ, given that these people are also consuming regularly? They're also consuming flower and non-flower for the purpose of unwinding, but they're a little bit different than the savvy connoisseurs in terms of their evangelism potential.
Yeah, I wonder about Jeff is like, does he even remember what the packaging looks like, or does he just buy it because it's the thing that he buys? Does it really matter to him? And how do you get him to try something new is because the choices are based on pricing. So I don't know, but I feel like everybody has emotional reaction to branding and packaging, even if you say that you don't but I feel like he will say that he chooses products based on facts and not feelings, but everybody has a feeling based on how you react to the packaging and the branding, whether you believe it yourself or not. So it's a really interesting, because once you get this guy as once you're his brand, the one that he likes, that's a lifer.
Yeah.
So
And I think that raises that question. And Diane, I'd like to hear from you. If this was a consumer where you knew that this was someone that liked pre-rolls, they're a pre-roll consumer, they consume pre-rolls every evening, and they have a brand that they like, how would you steal them from that other brand? What would your strategy be to say, well, look, this is a great consumer for us to have because they're regular and they're loyal, but right now they're loyal to someone else?
Well, that's a tough one. I don't know how I would steal them away. I like what you said, Amanda, about how this is kind of going to the grocery store for them. They're set. They know what they know what they want. And packaging is going to be really important to them. They don't they don't think that they look at the packaging. It was kind of like when I I went to my hair person and she said, what is this thing you're putting on your hair? I said, well, it's purple. It's in a purple package. And she said, are you kidding me? I said, no, I just know that's the one I get. I get the purple one. And, so I think that maybe this is I would hope that this would be the one that says, I get the one with the eagle on the front, rebel spirit. When it comes to stealing this person away from somebody else, I think you're going to have to give them a sample. You're going to have to run a promotion, and maybe they're going to get it from a savvy connoisseur at a party or something, but they're going to need to have something that takes them away, if just for a moment, from their regular brand, and you're going to need to impress them at that time.
Interesting. And yeah, I definitely think that because of the loyalty component, they want something that hits the same every time. They don't want to think about it. Like when I go to the grocery store and I buy Crest toothpaste, I don't want to think that every time I buy it, it may give me a different outcome, or it may have something different in it, or I might like it better this time or the other time. But to your point, Lily, I couldn't tell you what the Crest packaging looks like. I just know that like, that's what I get. So I think, to the point of like, how do we move these consumers from one brand to another? Another thing may be looking at which brands or which form factors are struggling. And so that consistency might not be there for them the way it used to be. And that might be a moment, like if all of a sudden Crest tasted completely different and terrible, I might be like, wow, it might be time to switch toothpaste because this one obviously isn't giving me the same result I had before. So maybe it's trying to figure out where is that moment of maybe I need to switch brands, and then being there already to say, yes, you do. And we're going to give you that consistency that you are no longer getting from your brand of choice. Like, I don't know what makes people switch cigarette brands.
Right.
I mean, price probably has something to do with it.
When it comes to consistency, though, with flour, what we found in Rebel Spirit is that what people want consistently is quality. Mm-hmm. They want consistent, high quality flour. Our flour happens to be all natural, but they do like a variety in their experience, which is why they are flour partakers. So if they wanted the exact experience every time, they would be using a vape pen or an edible, something that was more manufactured. The more natural the product is, the more variety there's going to be in it when it comes to consumption. I like to use the analogy of a handful of fresh cherries off of a tree. Each cherry is going to taste a little tiny bit different. They're all going to be delicious. If you want the exact experience, you should buy a pack of Cherry Lifesavers. So when it comes to Yes, when it comes to flour, I think it's interesting because when it comes to flour users they always want quality. Everybody wants quality, and in a pre-roll, they want something that smokes the same. But they are interestingly looking for a little bit of variety with their flour.
Well, that is really interesting. And I think that what you're making a really good point about one of the differentiating factors between savvy connoisseurs and the lifestylers. I think the savvy connoisseurs are probably a little bit more open to variety of experience because they're there for the experience, right? They're there to have an adventure. They're there to, interact with their favorite thing, cannabis. I think the lifestylers, to your point, are also definitely looking for quality. I might hypothesize that lifestylers are looking for a little bit more of a stable outcome, because if they're like, I just use this every morning before work, and one morning it's fine, and the next morning I'm way too high to go to work, that could be an issue. These folks are not using for medical purposes, so maybe they have a little bit more tolerance for a variety of effect. But I think that's part of being a lifestyler, is that it's like, I have my same breakfast every morning and I don't want it necessarily to be different. There can be some variety and tastes and things that I add to it, but anything wildly different kind of throws me off my routine. And so I think when we talk about the next group, we'll see even more, because again, we're kind of continuing this lifestyler. So, we talked about the contemporary lifestylers who are all in legal markets. Now we're going to talk about lifestylers who are not in legal markets at all. So let's visit with Otto, shall we? So Otto's 28. He lives in Austin, Texas. He's known his dealer since they met in freshman year of college. Otto enjoys trying new strains, but without alternatives, often purchases whatever his dealer has on hand. I remember those days. He regularly purchases upwards of half an ounce to share with his friends and family. He ends most evenings by sitting down in front of the TV and rolling a joint. Otto's intrigued by the idea of consumption lounges, but does not want to travel out of state for the same flower that he can buy at home. So again, we have consumers who are, a little bit less on the frequency side. So we're seeing 45% are consuming multiple times a day, 35% once every day or two. This is likely connected to access because, you're going to get whatever the person has whenever they're able to give it to you. For market context, again, these are not legal consumers. So these are either unregistered consumers in a medical market or living in an illicit market. And unsurprisingly, 90% identify as recreational because if they were medical, they may be able to get a card. And in an illicit market, you have really no choice but to identify as a recreational consumer. And 48% are consuming flower only. So we definitely see a higher rate of flower only among this group, which I think is definitely due to access, but 52% are consuming flower and non-flower, which shows that even in illicit markets, there is a market for manufactured products and that people can go out of state. So one of the stats I did not include, but is in our report, is the percent of times that where this consumer is buying in state versus out of state. And so, for example, if you are a legacy lifestyler and you want a manufactured product, you may have to travel someplace else in order to obtain that because it may not be available to you, or what is available to you may not feel safe. So because it's not tested. So thinking about these legacy lifestylers, right? So these are folks that are in illicit markets, but they are regular, frequent consumers. So we talked about whether it makes sense to think about who these folks are as a target market. We are going to see a few states here in just a few weeks consider legalization on their ballot. So, I'll start with you on this, Diane, and I want to know from a company perspective, and you share as much as you want about your own strategy. These are regular consumers. So these aren't your, infrequent partakers or your social nibblers. These are the folks that will likely be converted to contemporary lifestylers if their market goes legal. So how do you prepare for these folks, maybe after November, having access to a legal marketplace, knowing what you do about them?
Well, I'll just speak to our experience being a border state, so to speak. We, at any given time, 20 to 30% of our sales in Oregon are along the Idaho border.
Wow.
And so if Idaho were to ever go legal, we've got lots of Rebel Spirit fans already there. I think that our branding comes from a legacy idea of if you look at our origins of Uncle Mark and coming from, well, we're rebels, you're not going to tell us how to live freely. And so as we get ready, I think that Rebel Spirit at least is ready as a brand to take advantage of newly legal THC markets, because that's how those consumers are feeling at that point. When it goes legal, they're like, yeah, and I'm going to jump on this, and because I'm a rebel, because it does take a couple years really for the more hesitant users in an illicit market to get on board.
Well, I love that. And I love that you're kind of marketing to this transition point of access where people feel like now they actually have legal access, but like they still have this kind of spirit of like the rebellion.
Yeah.
And so I think that you're playing to that perfectly. Lily, from companies that are out there right now that are maybe listening and thinking about what a legal market might mean in terms of bringing their product to Missouri or to Maryland or to some other state, if they're trying to attract these folks that have been using already quite frequently, but they've been using and getting it from an informal source, what can businesses think about in terms of packaging and labeling, especially around manufactured products that are going to kind of convince these legacy lifestylers to use the regulated system?
Yeah, I think on the manufactured product side, that's going to be a lot easier because it's something that's not available already for them. So it's going to be something new and exciting that they can now go legally buy, like a beverage or edibles or something, or even like infused pre-rolls or stuff like that. Um, yeah, it's a really interesting challenge because it's not a new consumer in the sense that they've been consuming forever. So you can't be patronizing, but you do have to kind of make that value proposition clear on
Mhm.
how your product is better than the stuff that you've been getting previously. Maybe it's like a testing, cleanness, consistency play, or just the form factor of like, hey, this is something you probably never tried before. Check this out.
I think it also has a
Yeah.
lot to do with education because, as
Mhm.
you said, our little guy from Austin, Texas, Otto, was buying from his dealer, just kind of getting what he could get. He might not be educated about terpenes or about CBD content, or say buying a flower that tests 1-to-1 CBD THC. And so I think that those are the kinds of things that he or she's going to be really interested in as they read the back of the package and they start to buy into, wow, it's really cool to have tested, and I'm speaking specifically about flour here, to see what's in it and to start to train their own palate, so to speak, based on what they know about that particular flour product as shown in the testing.
Well, you know what we should do? We should have a program where savvy connoisseurs adopt legacy lifestylers when a new market opens and is like their cannabis buddy
Like a big
and tells
sister.
them about, how to be a savvy connoisseur and learn about all of these different nuances. So before we move on to the next archetype, I just want to answer a quick question that came in about the survey. So again, I probably should have said this at the beginning. It's all in the report, but this is based off of New Frontiers consumer survey that we do. It's over 4,000 cannabis consumers in the United States and over 2,000 non-consumers as well. It is generalizable to the census data of the United States. So that's how we populate the sample. And yes, these folks know that this is a survey about cannabis. They are contacted. They are in basically a pool of people that agree to do surveys. And so they're contacted to do this survey. And so that's how we get this sample. All right, so let's move on to medical lifestylers. So these is our last lifestyle group. So let's talk about George. George just turned 33 years old. In college, he was a linebacker and suffered a series of football injuries, which still caused him occasional discomfort. He has used cannabis for several years to avoid reliance on prescription medication and to combat his insomnia. George has purchased edibles and topicals in the past, but prefers the immediate onset of combustible products. He makes a weekly trip to the dispensary to buy 1/8 of an ounce of his favorite strain and some pre-rolls for walking his dog in the evenings. So again, lifestyle. I think, one key thing, whether we're talking about contemporary lifestylers, legacy, or medical, is that this is something that's part of their routine. This is just like taking any other medication. It's just like going to the grocery. It's just like having a meal. It's something that has become part of their routine. Now, contemporary lifestylers, that routine is more about wellness, unwinding, and recreational use. Legacy lifestylers, those are folks that are operating in the context of an illicit market. And then medical lifestylers are folks whose primary goal is some kind of medical use. But again, as we mentioned before, that doesn't necessarily mean that they're using a tincture or an edible or a topical, and that there are a lot of folks in the medical lifestylers group who are flower smokers, but are still using for medical purposes. So again, these are folks that are using multiple times a day. Over half of them are legal consumers. So, about half and half. We still have 28% living in an illicit market and 15% unregistered in a medical market, but 99% of them identify as medical consumers. So these are folks who are saying, yes, I am a medical consumer, even if they're in an illicit market, even if they're in a state where they're not registered as medical, that is how they identify themselves. Over half use both flower and non-flower, although just like the other lifestylers, we still see flower only be quite prevalent among this group. And they are, for the most part, over half in legal markets. So it's definitely possible that that they are accessing or have access to manufactured products that are in a legal context. And then, 52%, over half, say that their primary use is medical, with the second highest being 23% saying wellness. And one thing that really makes them different than the legacy lifestylers or the contemporary lifestylers is that only 7% say that their goal is unwinding. So, this is definitely not the I'm just smoking a joint at the end of the day to relax group. These are folks that have specific intentions. So, Lily, I'm going to throw it to you first here. When we talk about branding and packaging for medical consumers, for people who are saying, this is my goal, even though I do think that THC percentage and terpenes and some of these other things are important, what is some of the information that is really most important to the folks that are looking at it as medicine first?
Yeah, I think if this is mainly like a group that is using cannabis for pain or maybe like PTSD or something, it really needs to, the packaging and the marketing messaging needs to be about those conditions and how this product can solve those conditions, of course, without making claims, because we're not allowed to make claims. So that's the tricky thing when you want to say medical things, but you're not technically allowed to. So you have to like imply those sort of things. And this is kind of the group of products where it tends to have like that cleaner, more pharmaceutical-ish looking look, because it's not for fun. Like I feel like this group wouldn't necessarily be super drawn to like fun cartoon packaging because it's for pain or cancer or something. So
yeah,
it's not for fun.
Well, that makes a lot of sense. A few years ago, I was a judge for the Emerald Cup for the tincture category. And unlike the flower category, one of the criteria in the tincture category is packaging, because, the primary consumption of tinctures is for medical use. And so we were evaluating things like, is this easy to dose? So like if I got this tincture bottle, would I know exactly how much to take or how much is in a dose? Are the ingredients easy to spot and to read? Is the bottle easy to open and use, back to your point about folks that are using for medical reasons. So I definitely think that there's things if people are identifying as I'm a medical consumer, that they're looking for out of packaging, and that might turn them off because, as you said, these folks are going to be turned off by some of the more outlandish, loud packaging because it doesn't jive with their own perception of themselves as a medical consumer. So then, Diane, I want to ask you, your product looks like a pack of cigarettes, right? It's pre-rolls. It kind of comes in that form. Do you ever think that might be, turning off or causing people that really identify as medical consumers, giving them pause about that product just because of the messaging we've gotten around that form factor?
Absolutely. Rebel Spirit as a brand speaks to the person who wants to unwind. Generally speaking, we've never marketed ourselves to the medical market. And honestly, if I were to go for this market, I'd probably create a different brand. With different packaging, because it's a completely different demographic or psychographic, which is the underlying psyche of the consumer, that we've just never addressed. I would welcome medical people to use Rebel Spirit, and I'm sure that many do, but that's not who we target in our marketing.
And that's really interesting, talking about the kind of psychographics that go on underneath this, because when we talk about medical identity and the stigmatization around being a cannabis consumer, I think in some situations, identifying as a medical patient is a way to dissolve a little bit of that stigma. And so a lot of the products that people choose, the packaging that people are drawn to, are things that are going to reinforce that identity and aren't going to cause people this kind of cognitive dissonance of like, well, I'm using for medicine, but this doesn't look like medicine. And, cannabis has been kind of thrown under the bus in terms of it even being able to be a medicine. So I think folks kind of overcompensate by wanting to select form factors that kind of really speak to their own identity, which we've seen throughout these different archetypes, including the savvy connoisseur. All right, we're going to move on.
I just want
Right.
to say
So,
one more
oh,
thing.
go ahead, Diane. Yeah.
And that is that if you're going to be a brand, you cannot be everything to everyone.
Mm-hmm.
You know, and
Yeah.
so I'm
Oh,
not saying
absolutely.
you necessarily have to stay in your lane, but that's why I'm saying if we wanted to go after that medical lifestyle, we would need a different brand.
So I do want to take this one question before we move on to the modern medicinals, which is, do we have any evidence that any of these archetypes care about things like where their product comes from, or whether it was organic, or how the company that they buy from is? And I would say, to be honest, it isn't a differentiating factor for these archetypes. But if I had to think about an archetype that would probably be most engaged in that, it would be the savvy connoisseur, because they tend to want to know the most about the product beyond just this is the THC percentage or this is the terpene profile. So we don't really see a lot of, this group really cares about farmers and this group really cares about organic. Because, to be completely honest, and I do think this will change as the market evolves, price and effect are still ruling the day in terms of what people care about when they're deciding to purchase a product. So I think that still overrides a lot of these other factors, which is why we really don't see it come out in a stark way between archetypes. But let's move on to modern medicinals. So now we've kind of covered the savvy connoisseur, which is, I think, what people for a long time assumed all cannabis consumers were.
Mm-hmm.
And then we got into the lifestylers. So people that are really just very frequent consumers, may live in different markets, may have different intentions for consuming, but are really weaving cannabis into their daily life the way they would weave out in any other product like toothpaste or vitamins, or, going to a certain grocery store and buying a certain brand. And now we're going to get into the more unique, I think, archetypes, and ones where there's a lot of opportunity for differentiation. So we're going to start with the modern medicinal. So Sharon is 52. She lives in Eugene, Oregon. Maybe she buys Rebel Spirit. She suffered from migraines for years, trying several prescriptions and over-the-counter medications with limited success. Cannabis helps Sharon mitigate her symptoms. She dabbled with edibles, but tinctures, which allow her to dial in her dosage depending on what is needed that day, are her preferred products. Each month, Sharon drives to her local dispensary to resupply. So, this is not that different from what we heard from the contemporary lifestylers or medicinal lifestylers, right? So these are folks that are using specifically for a medical purpose. That is why they're using. But we'll see some key differences here. And one of those key differences is in frequency of consumption. So the modern medicinals, only 18% are consuming multiple times a day. What we're really seeing is more half of them consuming every day or two. So this is going to be driven by symptom management. So, Sharon isn't going to use cannabis if she doesn't have symptoms. She's using cannabis specifically to mitigate symptoms, and she's found a form factor tincture that works for her. So similar to the medical lifestylers or even the contemporary lifestylers, she may not be one that's going to switch unless she has a really good reason to. Either the one that she's using is no longer serving her purposes, or she has a bad experience, or something else comes out on the market that seems to be even more tailored to her. So in this case, I could think if research came out, for example, showing that there was a newly discovered minor cannabinoid that seemed to play a major role in headache or migraine mitigation. And then she saw at the dispensary that there was a new tincture out that had that minor cannabinoid, that maybe she would select that and switch, or at least try it, because her goal is to mitigate headaches. So I think thinking about branding, it's really looking at what are these individuals trying to accomplish. So you'll see 70% of these folks are legal consumers, so they have access to regulated sources. And like the medicinal lifestylers, 96% identify as medical users. So these are people that are firmly in the medical camp. And 69% are non-flower only. So I think, unlike the lifestylers who are kind of like, well, this just fits into my lifestyle, and sometimes I use flower, sometimes I don't, but it's for medical purposes. These folks are medical consumers, and they're also moving away from flower. So only 1% of them are consuming flower only, and 60% are consuming for medical purposes, 20% for wellness, and 16% for unwinding. So, kind of similar to our medical lifestylers, Lily, I'll ask you first, does packaging matter? Is this person going to be buying the same thing, she's probably not going to be distracted by new packaging, as long as what she has tells her how to dose, and has the ingredients and has the information she needs to be successful, right?
Yeah, I feel like this is still a person who might be coming over from CBD only products onto the THC market. So it's still a new market we can capture. And I feel like, just from a gut feeling, that this person is the kind of person who would be into kind of the wellnessy things with words like holistic and botanical and sun grown. Like, I feel like Sharon would be into that, because I feel like Sharon probably shops at like the local health food stores as well.
So what you're saying is people that might just be open to plant-based medicines or alternative health, and may fall into this group, and, you know, may be kind of sensitive to some of the same marketing and labeling and verbiage that we see in the more broader wellness market.
For sure. Yeah. And I personally feel like there's still a lot of people who are still buying CBD only because they're a little afraid of THC. But then with these sort of products, that the form factor of like a tincture or like a low dose edible, where you can have that control and really have accurate dosing, is gonna give them that certainty of like being willing to give it a go. Don't think this market is like super interested in like exploring and trying new shit.
We'll get to those people.
Yeah.
I think they may be next.
Yeah.
Diane, do you have any thoughts about this archetype and how it relates to your brand?
Super interesting, and I think that this archetype is underserved by our market because of our lack of research and our lack of ability to make medical claims. What caught my ear, Amanda, is when you were talking about certain cannabinoids or say terpenes that could be really serve her for her headache. And you know that we all have cannabinoid receptors in our bodies, and what works for one person might not work for another. And so it's going to be really important for Sharon to be able to experiment with which tincture hits her particular headaches. And so she's going to need some education and some guidance from a bud tender, and it's probably going to be anecdotal, and she's going to have to check around a lot, but more research for this.
Yeah,
person.
I totally agree. I think that this is definitely, and again, we talk about the aging population. This group is only going to grow. Right, as we move along. So let's talk about the engaged explorers, Lily. So, you know, these are your folks that are like, I'll try it. This sounds good. So let's talk about Tom. Tom is 24. Last year, he moved from Alabama to Colorado with his fiance. While as a teenager, Tom had smoked with friends. Entering the legal market was a game changer. He enjoys bringing a vape pen to the bar most weekends. He has a dab rig at home for concentrates. There are 3 dispensaries within 5 miles of Tom's apartment. He visits each one regularly to see what new products are in stock. He is especially excited when he finds a new flavor of infused beverage or edible among his favorite brands. So I kind of call this person like on their way to being a savvy connoisseur. Like this person is like a savvy connoisseur in training. They have new access to a legal market, either because they just moved to one or one just opened where they live. And, you know, they're trying to figure out what they like and they want to try everything. This person basically has no loyalty at this point. They're only consuming once every day or two. So they haven't moved into regular consumption because it hasn't become part of their lifestyle. So this is kind of the pre-lifestyler, the pre-savvy connoisseur. These are legal consumers for the most part, because a lot of times that's what sets off this exploration, is this access, this newly found access. These are mostly recreational folks. So these are folks that are exploring cannabis for fun and relaxation. They're all about both flower and non-flower, and non-flower only. So when you think about someone that's maybe been a legacy lifestyler and then their market goes legal, and now they have access to a whole bunch of manufactured products that they didn't have before, a lot of that exploration may take place in the non-flower market. So like the other kind of recreational archetypes, these folks are using for unwinding primarily. So do you think, Lily, are these kind of the savvy connoisseur, contemporary lifestylers in training?
Yeah, I think that's a perfect way to describe it, because they are, oh, I wish I was this person who's like willing to give anything a try. And like, it's interesting like how to market to them. Like it's kind of the similar play as the savvy connoisseur, but also the knowledge and education base is a little lower. So they might not yet exactly know what they like. So maybe trial sizes are the way to go for this, and like having like a tabling thing where you're telling about the product. Maybe that's the way to reach this person, especially if they're visiting the dispensaries like all the time.
Yeah. I love that. I love the trial size idea and kind of like, how do you bring people in? So, Diane, I mean, this is a person where they could be, if they become a savvy connoisseur or a lifestyler and they like Rebel Spirit, that could be it, right? They could be a Rebel Spirit consumer for life, an evangelist for life. So how do you capture this person before they decide what their usual brand is?
Well, I like what Lily said about trial sizes. This is somebody who's going to be a sampler. And so what this person samples needs to be top quality, top notch from the very beginning.
Mm.
So you're only going to get one chance because they're floating around all over the place. And so you've got to be sure to hit it right. There's somebody who in the dispensary might be willing to try based on a promotion. Or some other giveaway, something that's going to, get them, you got to get a foot in the door, so to speak, with them. But they're definitely the person that are ripe for the grabbing, and we definitely want to make them a brand loyalist for sure, if you have that opportunity.
Yeah, no, I love that. That's great points. I know my local dispensary has a wheel on Tuesdays that you get to spin. And has products on the wheel. So maybe you want to be one of those products, right? Because you know that the engaged explorer is excited to try new things. All right, we're going to move on to social nibblers. So this is our infrequent edibles group. So Susie is 21, newly graduated with a bachelor's degree in business computing. Her roommate works in a bakery and regularly experiments by infusing her favorite recipes with cannabis. Yum. Susie rarely purchases her own cannabis, but sometimes taste tests her roommate's concoctions and occasionally contributes for a larger baked brunch or movie night with friends. So now you can see we're getting into these kind of more infrequent partakers. But I think there's a lot of opportunity here because these are folks that do not have a favorite brand. They do not have a cannabis use regime or lifestyle, but they're interested in it, right? They're canna curious, I think is a term that we use a lot. So these are folks that are consuming once to a few times a year. They're not all legal consumers. So because they're not purchasing, being a legal consumer isn't as much as important as just who can supply them. So, if they are living in an illicit market, but their friend has edibles or things that they're making, then they absolutely can have the same type of once or twice a year consumption pattern. 98% are identifying as recreational. 59% use non-flower only. So this is what kind of gets them different from the infrequent partakers, which we'll talk about in a minute. And, these are mostly non-medical. So unwinding is a really big thing with them as well. So, kind of from an edible packaging perspective, this is not someone that's buying their own, but is there some type of way that an edibles company could lure in someone who is an infrequent consumer of edibles, a social nibbler, and make them more frequent? Lily?
Yeah, I wonder once once she moves away from living with the roommate who always has the edibles on the ready, like whether she would then go and like find something like a chocolate bar on her own. Yeah, it's an interesting challenge, especially with somebody this young, where it might be both an access issue in terms of legality and also just access issue in terms of like just not even thinking about going and buying your own. So yeah, I think this person, if somebody comes to the party with some like manufactured edibles or like a pack of can, that might be a thing that she will then go and like find later.
Well, I was thinking if I were an edibles company and I wanted to get this person or get them engaged and it was an illegal market, I would sponsor like a infused dinner or an event or something, and then really try to target these folks to come to it. because she's already like engaging in that kind of thing, but just at home. So maybe these are folks that would want it to be part of an experience, and that's a way to get them engaged. Diane, do you have any thoughts on this group?
Well, I just have thoughts based on my own tragic experience with over imbibing edibles. In newly legal states, I don't know how other states are handling it, but in Oregon, very quickly, there was a public service campaign that came out and it was called Try 5, so 5 milligrams. And so I feel for this particular this particular group, this archetype is going to, education is going to be super important. As Lily said, yeah, a can. So start small, move your way up, branch out from there. I think that if she's imbibing at home with her roommates, it's because she trusts her roommates. It's because if she's at home and overdoes it a little bit, she can sleep it off. And I think that this is the kind of person who might be trepidatious about going out purchasing. Well, how do I do it? This is different. This is not what my roommate makes, and so on. And so if for the edible manufacturer who wants to draw this person in, it's going to be a lot about education, helping them feel secure and giving them the pathway to the experience that they want.
Or maybe even like showing up at a music festival and offering sampling and encouraging people to buy in like festivals and events and stuff where you can have consumption. Isn't there one state that now allows you to buy cannabis beverages in a bar? I feel like I've read about that.
Yeah,
that would definitely be a place where this consumer might buy it, is in a social setting at like a party.
Yeah, very interesting. All right, we're going to move on. We've got just a couple more to go. I appreciate everyone hanging with us. I know this is a ton of information. So let's move on to holistic healers. So I know someone had asked if holistic was kind of a subsample of the modern medicinals, and they're not. They have kind of a unique aspect to them, which we're going to get to. So Ethel is a 67-year-old recent retiree, volunteering part-time at her local library to stay busy. She used to be an avid runner and still enjoys an occasional 5K run. Ethel's first cannabis purchase was a broad spectrum CBD topical found in the supplement section of her local organic market. Since then, she has discovered that full spectrum THC topicals sold at a nearby dispensary effectively combat her joint pain. While she has tried edibles and tinctures, she remains primarily interested in the pain management benefits that topicals provide. So, this is somebody that is consuming rarely. So again, one or maybe once or twice a year, or even less than once a year. And they're looking for kind of non-ingestible forms of consumption. So on nearly half are legal consumers. Most identify as medical users. So 95% are medical users, and most are using non-flower only. And this is really what separates them from modern medicinals. Even though we see a higher rate of modern medicinals using non-flower than, say, savvy connoisseurs or contemporary lifestylers, this is really primarily non-flower. So these are your non-flower once or twice a year consumers. 60% are consuming for medical purposes. And so we're definitely seeing this be, more of like folks that are looking for plant-based medicine. She bought it in the grocery store because it was just CBD. And so, I don't think we need to discuss this group that much, partially because I want to be mindful of time, but also because this isn't necessarily a target market. I think it's important to say that not everyone's a target market if you have limited funds and time to spend on developing market share. So, if you're looking for medical consumers, maybe you want to do some outreach with this type of consumer. If you have a non-flower product that's really meant, where someone can buy one and they use it all year, it's not necessarily your high return type of consumer. So I don't think we need to go too much into this, but Lily and Diane, I want to give you a chance to comment on this consumer as well.
Yeah, topicals, it's interesting how it's such a small segment of the market, even though the topicals have such a huge opportunity to help people. This graph kind of bums me out.
I think that this archetype is going to benefit a lot when we get some sort of national legalization, because in any given state, the market segment is too small to make it practical for anybody to go after it and to market to them. And you're going to have a really rough time making money.
Yeah, I wonder
Yep.
if Ethel would be into it more if it came from a doctor or came in like a capsule type of form factor.
Well, I think you make a really good point, which is that under federal legalization, let's say that we have a program where medical cannabis can be prescribed by a doctor, it can be reimbursed by insurance. I think these are the types of consumers that are going to move into that marketplace because they're going to want it reimbursed. They're going to want access to kind of pharmaceutical grade or medically approved type products, and they don't use them very often.
Right.
So, having one tub of topical for an entire year may not be that strange for somebody in this category. All right, so let's move into our infrequent partakers. So Robert is 64 years old and living in New Jersey. He tried cannabis with his friends back in the day, listening to King Crimson on vinyl. They're a band for you out there listening who are not old enough to know. After a 26-year hiatus, one of Robert's friends gave him a cannabis topical and a few joints, suggesting they might help ease his lower back pain. While the topical provided some relief, Robert found he preferred the nostalgia of smoking flower. When next time his friend visited, he bought a 1/4 ounce of flower and now rolls a joint every few months to relax at the end of a long day, supplemented by the occasional gift from Robert's son. He will not soon need to buy any more flowers. So I feel like this is the opportunity guy, right? And especially for you, Diane, I'm like thinking this is a future Rebel Spirit customer. So these are folks that are very infrequent partakers right now. So right now, less than once a year, a few times a year, less than half are legal consumers. So a lot of these folks are in markets that could turn, where opportunity could come, where they could become more like engaged explorers. They're primarily recreational folks as well. And they're mostly flower only. Now, part of this could be because they haven't had exposure to these other products, especially if a lot of these folks are those that are coming back to the market after a few decades of not using cannabis. We see unwinding still being the primary reason why these people are consuming. So, Diane, I'm going to start with you because from my perspective, I'm like, oh, this is a Rebel Spirit customer, right? Because they're looking for the nostalgia of kind of how they used to consume cannabis. And they may be in a place where it's flower that they have access to. Right now they're not purchasing. Right now they're just getting what someone else gives them. But you could see a scenario where this individual either moves to a regulated market or the place they live becomes regulated, or they just start to really enjoy it again and kind of remember why they liked cannabis so much back in the day. So I'm curious, Diane, what you think about this consumer, because they seem to have a lot of potential.
They do have a lot of potential. And I think a lot of it for our particular brand and for our wheelhouse has to do with pre-rolls as a form factor. Mm-hmm. So this is a person who, as he gets more into it, so to speak, and goes to a dispensary, will buy a pack of pre-rolls, will have them say around the house, go to a party, give one away, and isn't necessarily using them every day, but because he's a flower smoker, he wants it available to him in a handy form, in a convenient form. It's interesting, in new markets, pre-rolls don't really take off in new markets until a couple years into the market, and that's because everybody gets all excited about vapes and dabbing and all of these fancy ways of consuming. But eventually those smokers come back to, I just want to smoke a joint. I don't want a lot of extra equipment. And I want it to be easy. I want it to be fast. And Robert's our man for sure.
Yep. Absolutely. So Lily, what can brands do to cater to consumers like Robert, who are basically coming back to cannabis? They may be turned off by all of the vapes and the edibles because it's complicated and they know what they like and they know what they're used to, which is pre-rolls. I've definitely seen cannabis out there that I think is is kind of advertising to that consumer. I know there's a farm out here that has a cultivar called Mom's Weed. I've seen Dad Weed. And I think that that's probably trying to speak to people that are like, when was it just weed? Like, isn't, you know, they don't really understand the kind of this evolution of products. So how can brands capture that group, the group that's really coming at this from a nostalgia perspective?
Yeah, I feel like this is definitely like a nostalgia play where I could see our man Bob here buying like a brand from like Cheech and Chong or Santana or like some music or celebrity that he likes, who's his generation, who he aspires to be, and like in a form factor that feels comfortable and like something that he knows how to do. Doesn't have the patience to start these newfangling things. So kind of that like 1960s, 1970s look and feel, kind of rock and roll, pickup trucks, that sort of thing.
And familiarity.
Yeah.
Right. So, you know, one of the things I hear a lot from consumers that are coming back to cannabis is, well, this is not the same cannabis that I had when I was growing up. This is way stronger. You know, when my parents come to town, they're in their 70s, they're both consumers. You know, we're looking for the balance, you know, we're looking for the 1-to-1, we're looking for the higher CBD, because a lot of the products on the market just don't jive with them. I mean, for one reason, they haven't used in a while. And as we get older, our metabolism changes and we can't necessarily consume the same way we did when we were younger. So I think there's absolutely a play for consumers like this that are coming back into the market, similar to engaged explorers, but engaged explorers want to try it all, right? They want to leave the dispensary with 5 different brands and all kind of different products. They want to go dispensary shopping. You know, these folks are coming back into it and they're definitely willing to be open. They don't have a favorite brand. They don't have brand loyalty, but they're looking to recreate an experience that they had before versus creating something new for them. And I think that that's important. All right, so I'm going to let you have some final thoughts because we've actually made it through all of the archetypes. Yay. And I appreciate everyone that stuck with us. Again, you can download this report, the whole report, from the New Frontier Data website, which is just newfrontierdata.com. I did want to answer one of the other questions that came in while you gather your final thoughts, and that was about where in this whole thing do cosmetics fit in. We're definitely seeing more interest in minor cannabinoid development with different types of cosmetics. So the answer that I will give is it depends on the goal. I think beauty cosmetics, I think your consumer is going to be the savvy connoisseur. I think that they're more likely to try different types of cannabis products that are out there. So if they see a cosmetic in their dispensary that has, you know, THC in it, or they see something at their local drugstore that has CBD in it, I think they're going to be more likely to just try it because they like to try all things cannabis. So I think that that's definitely going to be your person. If you're looking at this as a medical product, so if you're advertising this as helping with inflammation or rosacea or eczema or some of these other kind of skin issues, I think you're looking at more the modern medicinal, the holistic healer, the people that are using for medical purposes and are seeking non-flower options. So that's the answer there. So I'm going to let you ladies give us your last thoughts, but I wanted to call attention that all of our emails are up here. These ladies were very gracious to give out their email addresses. So if you have follow-up questions, if there are things specifically about what we talked about today that you want to follow up with, you know, if you'd like to hire Lily to work on your branding and packaging, if you want to work with Diane and find out more about Rebel Spirit and all the amazing things they're doing, please feel free to reach out to any of us. We'd love to hear from you. So Lily, please, final thoughts.
I'll get on my soapbox. So all of my clients come to me originally with like, we want to sell to everybody. And I'm here to tell you, you can't do that. Well, you can sell to everybody, but you can't target everybody. So you really do need to pick your target, know what the problem they have in their life that your product is there to fix. Because if it's kind of for everything for everybody, it's not going to feel like it's going to fit anybody specifically. So get your target market really tight, know who you're speaking to. That makes all of your marketing and all of the choices so much easier, because that one will our target audience person Sharon like this or not.
Mm-hmm. Great advice. Great advice. Diane, final thoughts?
Yeah, I think that Lily's made an excellent point, and it does have to do, in my mind, with letting people be where they want to be. And presenting with Rebel Spirit, we present ourselves as who we are, and hopes that we will be the flame, that people will come to. And so we're always, I would say, be really authentic. And so pick your target. But it's true what Lily said. If you're scooting around and trying to make everybody happy, you can't really be authentic. And so a brand has to know its roots. It has to know who they are and stay true to them. And my plug is that Rebel Spirit's working on taking our brand nationwide. And so if you are a CEO out there looking also to expand and would like to partner up with us on a project in another state, get in touch with me. I'd love to talk to you.
Fantastic. Well, I'm going to stop my share so we can see everybody. Well, I really want to thank you ladies for joining today. I know this was a lot of information and you did just a beautiful job of giving feedback and guidance. And I think folks that are watching this are going to find a lot of useful information in what we had today. Again, feel free to download this report. It's going to go into a lot more detail on each specific archetype. And it's also going to go into more detail on some of these demographic indicators of archetype differentiation that we went over, as well as extensive information about the methodology that was used in order to develop these archetypes. So we do update these archetypes every year. One of the things we didn't get into is we lost an archetype from one year to another. We gained a couple archetypes, and this is normal. This is really how the cannabis consumer is evolving and will continue to evolve. So as long as that's happening, New Frontier will be here to give you your latest in archetypes. I'll also mention if anyone's going to be at MJ BizCon in November, please come see us on the expo hall. You'll have more opportunities to learn about archetypes. You'll even be able to take a quiz to determine which archetype you are, and we will all be on hand to help you determine how to take that information about who your target audience is, and then use the data to figure out how to reach them and what they're looking for. So I really look forward to seeing everybody there. Lily and Diane, thank you again for joining us today. I think this was very useful, I hope, to the audience. And to everyone out there, we will be seeing you next time. Thanks so much for joining.
Thank you, Amanda. I appreciate the opportunity.
Thank you.
My pleasure.